all of you. Today we are going to discuss reflection on death in the poetry of Emily Dickinson. There's been a death in the opposite house. That's the poem of Emily Dickinson. And about the poetess, Emily Dickinson was one of the most influential and eminent American intellectuals of 19th century. She was born in 10th December 1813 in Amherst, Massachusetts, and died in 15 May 1886 in her house. In the modern poetic world of America, Emily Dickinson plays a significant and multifarious role that makes her different from other contemporary American poets. Emily's original and powerful mind, as well as her an icon in the realm of American literature, she wrote poetry of great power, questioning the nature of death, immortality, Trinity, religion, nature, love, God, and so on. However, Dickinson is renowned for her morbid sensibilities and her preoccupation with the theme of death. Death triggers our fear and curiosity because it advances suddenly without any preparations and expectations. Death is a mysterious and sheer truth which nobody likes. It is a naturally occurring phenomenon of the human life cycle. Emily Dickinson's unique treatment of death stands remarkable in the history of American poetry and literature. Emily Dickinson's treatment of theme of death in her poetry may be regarded as one of her outstanding contributions to American literature. She wrote more than 500 poems on the subject of death. These poems offer a sincere attempt to understand the true nature of death. Death in these poems takes various contradictory images and pers- personalities such as coachman, a cunning courtier, a democrat, a lover, a murderer, a wild beast, a frost, a brutal killer, etc. In many of her poems, Dickinson personifies death in various characters. For example, in the only ghost I ever saw, she personifies death as, I quote, "The only ghost I ever saw was dressed in McLean's suit. He wore no sandals on his foot and stepped like flakes of snow." Unquote. The concept of death as something to be embarrassed finds best expression in Because I Could Not Stop for Death, where Dickinson actually personifies death as a gentleman who kindly stopped to collect the speaker in his carriage. I could, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped it for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. Unquote. In some poems, Emily Dickinson portrays death as a cruel, personal enemy and as a brutal killer who attacks his victims without any mercy or permission. In A Clock Stopped It, the poet shows how her subject suffers in dying moments. I quote, "A clock stopped it, not the metals Geneva's fortress scale cannot put the puppet going that just now deckled the steel." An awe came on the trinket. The figures haunched with pain, then quivered out of decimals into degree-less noon. Unquote. In the What Cared the Death for Caterpillar, Dickinson portrays death as a leveler, that is, there is no exception for death. She uses death as a God's vehicle to bring all human lives to heaven. I got What cared the death for Canticleer? What cared the death for day? These let your sunrise wax their face, and purple ribaldry of morning pour as blank on them as on the tier of wall the mason builded yesterday, and equally as cool. Unquote. In Death in the Shooter, Death assumes the character of a skillful lover wooing a lady. I quote, "Death is the shooter that wins at last. He moves slowly with craft aiming, not too offended by being too bold. It is the stealthy wooing conducted first by Pallet Inonduos and the approach achieving success in his wooing. He comes with Beckles and a coach, and it bears away in triumph to truth unknown. Unquote. And they dropped it like flags. That is portrayed in a positive way. It is viewed it as an ordinary matter, but still it is under the control of God. I quote, they dropped it like flags. They dropped it like a star, like petals from a rose when suddenly across the June a wind with fingers goes. They perished in the seamless grass. No eye could find the place, but God on his repealless list can summon every face. Unquote. In conclusion, in a nutshell, death has its own claims on Emily Dickinson. When the Martin believes that death was problem for Dickinson, or a riddle she could never solve, but which she always explored. Unquote. That Dickinson almost faced every day is the central problem of her life. She saw it all around herself in her family, friends, love, life, and convictions. The theme of death in the poetry of Dickinson has attracted a large critical attention. Death is not only one of her most frequent themes, but also one that preoccupies her lifelong attention. Dickinson was preoccupied with death throughout her life. A reason for such an immense preoccupation in her involvement with religious and spiritual values such as time, God, eternity, immortality, nature, and love. Works consulted. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.